The ocean seems to be swallowing a city that should never have existed. Dark basalt walls rise from shallow water. Narrow canals twist between more than 100 artificial islets. Mangrove roots push into ancient foundations. Tides move through royal courtyards. And every year the sea reaches farther into a place built from hundreds of thousands of cubic meters of stone. For generations, Nan Madol was described as a city deliberately constructed on the ocean. A Pacific Venice created by rulers powerful enough to command men to move gigantic volcanic columns across an island. But new dating has revealed something far more unsettling. The city may not have begun in the water at all. Researchers recently examined coral taken from the interiors of Nan Madol's walls and platforms. Coral is not just building material, it is a clock. When coral grows, it traps radioactive elements that begin changing at a measurable rate. By testing those elements, scientists can estimate when the coral was alive and when people harvested it for construction. The new study analyzed more than 160 coral samples from 18 islets, then compared them with charcoal dates, sea level records, climate patterns, and the surviving architecture. The result changed the timeline. Nan Madol was not built in one sudden burst. It rose in two major phases, separated by a mysterious pause. The first great phase began around the early 10th century and continued into the early 12th. Then construction nearly stopped for about 40 years. After that silence, building returned with greater intensity and continued from the late 12th century into the early 15th. During this second phase, more coral was used, more effort went into sea defenses, and the rulers demanded labor on a scale the island may never have seen before. The most curious part is what happened beneath the city during those centuries. Pohnpei was slowly sinking, while the relative level of the sea was rising. The famous canals may have expanded as water moved into ground that had once been much drier. That means the most recognizable feature of Nan Madol may be partly the result of a long disaster. The old question was how a small island society built a city on the sea. The new question is why they continued investing more labor as the sea became more dangerous. Instead of moving inland, they brought coral, basalt, food, workers, priests, and rulers back to the same vulnerable coast. Pohnpei is a high volcanic island covered in heavy rainforest and surrounded by a reef. Rain falls in enormous amounts. Rivers descend from the mountains. Mangroves spread along parts of the coast, and the lagoon creates a world where land and water overlap. Against this landscape, Nan Madol forms a roughly rectangular complex about 1.5 kilometers long. Its artificial islets are made from coral, rubble, and stone, contained by walls of basalt boulders and long volcanic columns that look like stacked logs. From above, the ruins appear planned. Water passages separate compounds used for different purposes. Some islets held residences. Others were connected to religious activity, food preparation, canoe building, medicine, ritual, or burial. The northeastern section, known as Pohnpei, contained many sacred and mortuary spaces. The southwestern section, Pohnpei, included residences and administrative areas. At the eastern edge stands Nandawas, the best-known enclosure, where massive walls surround a central royal tomb. Some of those walls still rise several meters high, creating the feeling of a stone fortress floating at the end of the world. Yet Nan Madol was probably not designed as a military fortress in the simple sense. Its open passages, ceremonial spaces, and specialized islets point to a political and sacred center. It was a place where the Sodalur dynasty displayed authority, controlled ritual, received tribute, and separated elite life from the wider population. The rulers drew people from districts across Pohnpei into one central system. Food had to be brought to the city because the artificial islets did not provide enough farmland. Fresh water was limited. The capital depended on constant support from communities outside it. Its very existence announced that the rulers could command the whole island. Pohnpeian oral traditions preserve the memory of Nan Madol in ways archaeology alone cannot. One famous account says 2 brothers, Olasopa and Olasipa, came from a distant land and searched for a place to build a center of worship. With supernatural help, they caused the great stones to fly into position. After one brother died, and the other became the first Sodalur. These stories are not engineering manuals, and they should not be treated as simple reports, but they preserve themes that matter. Outsiders, sacred power, centralized rule, and construction so difficult that later generations explained it through forces beyond ordinary human strength. The stones encourage those stories. Some individual pieces weigh several tons, and the total building material has been estimated at roughly 300,000 cubic meters. The walls use a distinctive method in which basalt columns run lengthwise and crosswise, like giant logs forming a box. Coral rubble and smaller stones fill the interior. Chemical analysis has linked some major architectural stones to volcanic sources on other parts of Pohnpei, including areas far from the problem. The island's interior is steep, wet, and heavily forested. Dragging giant columns across mountain ground would have demanded cleared routes, ropes, wooden supports, and huge teams. Water transport may have been more practical. Builders could have moved stone downhill to how many people it required and who paid the cost. The newest research suggests that cost may be central to Nan Madol's fall. The coral dates show that construction was not steady. During the first major phase, between roughly the early 10th and early 12th centuries, a wall safe from ordinary tides in one generation can stand in water centuries later. A beach can become a channel. A low platform can begin flooding. The change is slow enough that no single ruler sees the full movement, yet fast enough to reshape the life of a dynasty. The climate added sudden shocks to that slow pressure. El Niño and La Niña change winds, rainfall, currents, and sea level across the tropical Pacific. On Pohnpei, strong La Niña conditions can raise local water levels for days or weeks, while stronger easterly winds drive waves toward the exposed coast. Heavy rain increases erosion and runoff. Storm surges can break walls, wash coral, fill from platforms, and choke channels with sediment. The new study compared Nan Madol's construction history with ancient climate records from across the Pacific. The relationship was not simple, but it suggested that periods of stronger environmental stress may have pushed people to repair and reinforce the city. This creates a remarkable possibility. Damage may have encouraged construction. Each time the sea attacked Nan Madol, the Sotalur could demand workers from across Pohnpei to rebuild. The disaster became proof that more labor was necessary. Walls grew, platforms were repaired. The capital survived, and survival strengthened the rulers who organized it. But this system worked only while people accepted the demands. A seawall is never finished when the land beneath it continues sinking. Every repair becomes the beginning of the next repair. What looks like a monument to power may also be the record of a government locked in permanent emergency. The 40-year construction gap may fit this pattern. Climate records suggest a calmer period with reduced El Niño Southern Oscillation variability around part of the mid-12th century. If damaging surges became less frequent, the urgent need for repairs may have weakened. Construction slowed. Then activity returned after the late 12th century, and it returned at a much higher level. More than two-thirds of the dated coral from the main phases belongs to this later period. The city expanded when the sea was higher and the channels were becoming more regularly flooded. The Sotalur were building their greatest monuments, while the ground beneath their system became less secure. Nandawas belongs to this moment of transformation. High-precision uranium-thorium dates from live harvested coral placed the construction of its monumental tomb around 1180 to 1200. This made it one of the earliest securely dated examples of monumental architecture in remote Oceania. Its walls are among the most imposing at Nan Madol. Long basalt columns create outer faces, while coral and rubble fill the core. Inside lies a smaller central burial chamber once associated with powerful chiefs. The city grew over centuries. Different rulers inherited unfinished walls, repaired older platforms, and added new compounds. This matters because it removes the image of one king suddenly ordering the entire complex into existence. Nan Madol was a long project, altered by changing coastlines and generations of decisions. Its builders were not following one frozen master plan. They were adapting a sacred capital while the environment around it continued to move. By around 1180, relative sea level was still lower than today, but some channels may already have been flooded at middle tide, while others remained dry or shallow. By around 1380, the sea had risen farther and water was likely intruding into all the channels more regularly. This may be the period when Nan Madol began to resemble the floating city seen today. The transformation was gradual. Children born beside a dry passage could grow old beside a tidal canal. Their grandchildren might believe the water had always been there. The ocean did not destroy the city in one night. It rewrote its appearance one generation at a time. The distribution of coral from the later phase strengthens the seawall theory. A much larger percentage of dated coral from that period came from compounds connected with the outer sea defenses. The builders were not investing only in tombs and ritual displays. They were placing material where waves and rising water threatened the city. That does not prove every stone was part of a climate response, and the researchers warn that social and environmental forces cannot be separated perfectly. Still, the pattern is difficult to ignore. As the sea rose, more labor went toward the edge. The capital's greatest construction period was also its greatest period of defensive maintenance. Then, in the early 15th century, major construction stopped. Coral use fell sharply. Maintenance, repairs, and large new projects appear to have declined. A small number of later dates shows that people continued returning to Nan Madol and repairing parts of it, but the great building age was over. The timing is unsettling because the latest phase had demanded the most labor. Oral traditions describe the Sotalur rulers as increasingly oppressive. They required tribute and controlled people through a centralized system. In the stories, resentment grew until a warrior named Ezokalekal arrived, defeated the dynasty, and established a new political order based on regional chiefs. Archaeology cannot prove every detail of that account, and the exact date of Ezokalekal's conquest remains debated. But the new construction history fits the larger memory of a system under strain. Near the end, the rulers were demanding more building work than ever. Some of that effort may have protected communities and sacred places from real environmental danger. Some may have served elite power. Over time, the difference between necessary defense and unbearable obligation could have become impossible to see. A ruler could always point to the damaged seawall and say more workers were needed. The people supplying those workers may have reached a different conclusion. This is the darkest interpretation of Nan Madol. The city may have survived the ocean, but exhausted the government that maintained it. Each successful repair proved that another repair was possible. Each new wall increased the area that had to be defended. Each monumental tomb required more stone, food, transport, and labor. The Sodler created a capital that demonstrated their ability to organize an island, but that same capital became a machine that constantly demanded resources. When environmental pressure increased, the machine grew hungrier. The empire's proudest structure may have become the burden that made centralized rule impossible to continue. Other explanations remain possible. Political conflict may have been more important than climate. Changes in food production, population, trade, or religious authority could have altered the labor system. Researchers have proposed that improved breadfruit varieties may have increased agricultural surplus, allowing more people to work on monumental construction. Later climatic shifts may have reduced food security. Evidence is still incomplete. The new study does not claim that sea level rise alone destroyed the Sodler dynasty. Instead, it presents a dangerous interaction. Environmental threats increased construction needs, rulers increased demands, and the political system faced pressure while supporting a vulnerable coastal capital. The surrounding landscape reveals how that system fed itself. Airborne LIDAR, which uses laser pulses to map the ground beneath vegetation, has identified extensive ancient cultivation features on nearby Temwin Island. Researchers found a complex irrigated system unlike anything previously recognized in the central and eastern Caroline Islands. These fields likely helped produce food for the people connected to Nan Madol. The discovery changed the scale of the city again. The ruins were not isolated islands dependent on mysterious imports. They were tied to a managed landscape of agriculture, water control, roads, settlements, quarries, and coastal transport. The real capital extended beyond its visible walls. LIDAR matters because Pohnpei's vegetation hides low earthworks almost completely. From the ground, a ditch or a terrace can disappear beneath forest. From the air, laser measurements can filter away leaves and reveal subtle changes in elevation. The resulting map shows human organization written across the island. Nan Madol's builders were not only stoneworkers, they were farmers, navigators, engineers, ritual specialists, labor managers, and people who understood water at multiple scales. They controlled fresh water in fields while fighting seawater at the coast. The city's canals, once treated as its greatest mystery, were only one part of a much larger relationship with water. There is also an underwater mystery, but it is often exaggerated. Stories have long claimed that deeper ruins, roads, or stone pillars continue beneath the sea outside Nan Madol. Divers and sonar teams have investigated unusual shapes. Some supposed columns turned out to be coral, not human-made basalt structures. Other basalt pieces on the seabed may be material dropped during transport or walls that collapsed. No reliable survey has confirmed a vast lost city beneath deep water. The coastline has changed, and parts of the archaeological landscape may be submerged, but that is different from evidence for an advanced drowned metropolis hidden beyond the reef. Today, the same forces are still working. Storm surge and rising seas threaten foundations. Stonework has already collapsed in places. The site survived political change and centuries of abandonment, but survival does not mean safety. The ocean that helped create the city's modern appearance is now part of the threat that could erase it. Conservation is difficult because removing vegetation can also damage structures if roots are pulled carelessly. Clearing canals changes water movement. Rebuilding walls without complete records risks creating false versions of the past. Nan Madol remains culturally important to Pohnpeian communities and traditional leaders, so decisions cannot be made by outside engineers alone. Archaeology, local authority, oral tradition, environmental science, and practical conservation must work together. The goal is not to freeze the city at one imagined moment. It is to slow collapse while respecting that Nan Madol is both a sacred place and a living part of Pohnpei's identity. The newest coral dates provide a tool for that work. Knowing which areas were built during different phases can help specialists understand where walls were repaired repeatedly and which compounds responded to rising water. The dates show that construction intensified at the seawall during the later phase. That information may reveal where ancient builders expected the greatest damage. Their choices are evidence. A reinforced corner, a raised platform, or a change in coral fill can show how people adapted to previous conditions. Modern conservationists are reading an old defense system while facing a faster version of the same problem. Global sea level is now rising faster than the long-term rate used in the ancient reconstruction. Although local patterns vary, Pohnpei's communities may have far less time to adapt than Nan Madol's builders had. The ruins are not only history, they are a warning from a coastal crisis. The experiment asks a cruel question. When a community faces repeated coastal damage, is rebuilding a sign of resilience or a trap? Staying preserves continuity but increases risk. Nan Madol's builders chose to stay for centuries. Their city became greater as the danger grew. Then the building stopped. That silence after the early 15th century is more powerful than any legend. Workers no longer arrived in the same numbers. Fresh coral was no longer packed into platforms at the old rate. Basalt columns stopped moving toward new walls. A capital can die while its strongest stones remain standing. So what did scientists really discover when they redated Nan Madol? They found that its history was longer and less stable than the familiar story. The main building sequence stretched from the early 10th to the early 15th century. Construction came in two major waves with a 40-year gap. The late phase used more coral and placed far more effort into seawall compounds. Relative sea level rose as Pohnpei subsided. The ground that had been dry or only occasionally flooded became a network of tidal channels. The city's appearance changed while the dynasty was still building it. They also found no single cause for the rise or fall. Climate did not control people, like pieces on a board. The Sodler chose where to build, how much labor to demand, and whether to repair. Farmers produced food. Navigators moved stone. Priests gave the capital sacred meaning. Communities accepted or resisted obligations. Environmental pressure entered that human system and changed the cost of every decision. The sea was not an invading army. It was a force that made politics harder year after year, until a powerful center may have become impossible to support. The latest evidence, therefore, creates a more curious title for Nan Madol than Lost City of the Pacific. It may have been a capital transformed into islands by the ocean, a monument that expanded because it was threatened, and a political machine weakened by the work required to save it. Its great walls are not only proof of engineering power, they are records of repeated damage. Its canals are not only design features. Some may be the result of rising water occupying old ground. Its abandonment was not a sudden disappearance. It was the end of a centuries-long argument between stone, authority, and the sea. And the argument is not over. Tides still move through the ruins. Mangrove roots still widen cracks. Storms still test the outer walls. Researchers continue dating coral, mapping vegetation, studying quarries, and reconstructing ancient sea levels. Every new measurement can change the story because much of Nan Madol remains unexcavated, and many structures are hidden beneath growth. Somewhere inside a collapsed platform, another piece of coral may preserve the exact decade when a wall was raised against the water. Somewhere beneath the silt, an older ground surface may show how dry the city once was. The greatest mystery is no longer how ancient people placed every stone. It is why they kept placing stones when the ocean made each new wall harder to defend. Was Nan Madol a brilliant adaptation that protected Pohnpei's sacred center for centuries? Or did the city become so important that its rulers could no longer admit it was in the wrong place? The coral dates have revealed when the struggle intensified, but they cannot tell us what the last builders believed as they watched water enter the channels. Perhaps they thought one more seawall would be enough. Perhaps every generation thinks that until the sea proves otherwise,